Welcome to the Talent Cast, the lost episodes, or the lost interviews. I haven't decided what to call them as I record this, so I guess I have decided what to call them. Anyway, I did 4 amazing interviews during my break, my hiatus, well, at least when my hiatus started, when I was planning on coming back to the Talent Cast very quickly, and I have not made decisions as to whether or not I'm coming back to the Talent Cast, but I had these amazing interviews with some amazing, wonderful, smart people that I knew if I kept on my hard drive any longer, the guilt would just kill me, and I needed to get these things out to the world. So that's what we're doing. We're releasing the lost interviews in one foul swoop. I hope you enjoy them, but we have a few housekeeping notes, first of which is I have got to thank Chad and Cheese of Chad and Cheese. That's that's Chad Sowash and Joel Cheeseman, who not only are good friends of mine and who just turned 50 a day apart from each other. So that feels suspicious somehow. Anyway, neither here nor there. They and the Evergreen Network have sponsored and kept my podcast going for the last year plus, and I really do appreciate what them and what they've done and how they've really kind of pushed the employer brand recruitment marketing space forward in the podcast world. So thank you, Joel. Thank you, Chad. Thank you so much for having me as part of this network. And we'll see where the future takes us. I don't know where that's going to be. 2 other notes. First, that book I wrote and then that other book I wrote? I'm making them free. Not just, hey, it's on Amazon, I don't have any cost here, I'm lowering the cost really. I mean, literally, I put it all in a Google Doc, and if you go to employerbrandbook.com, it takes you to the Google Doc. The actual text and images of the books are right there. They're freely available for you to read, for you to copy and paste, for you to clip stuff from, for you to share, to give to your boss, to give to your coworkers, whatever you want, I'm putting it out in the world. My goal, as always, both of the podcast and the newsletters and the books and all that stuff, is to raise the conversation of employer brand, to let people know how amazing employer brand can be. Rather than try and flog a book, I'm trying to say, here, take it, get some value out of it. Share this with people who need to have their perspective changed on what employer brand can be. That's what it's all there for. I don't make a penny. How could I? It's a Google Doc. So please share. That again is employerbrandbook.com. Second thing, my efforts that used to go into the podcast now go into a weekly newsletter called Employer Brand Headlines. If you like the podcast, you're going to love the headlines. Why? 1, you don't have to hear my voice. 2, I write like I talk, so it's almost like you hear my voice. And 3, you can read my little newsletter in much less time it takes than to listen to a podcast. So there you go. It's much faster. If you go to employerbrand.news, there it is. Go ahead and sign up. It's free. It drops every Monday. And, we have 1,500 subscribers, which I think makes us the biggest employer brand newsletter in the world, which is crazy, but there you go. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for subscribing. Thank you so much for being a part of this podcast. Like I said, I don't know what the future holds, but I appreciate you being a part of it and listening and sharing and telling me what you thought. I really listened to every word. I don't know where the future is. I don't know where we're heading, but I look forward to what we've got next. So without any further ado, thank you so much again. Here's the interview. All right. Another wonderful conversation. I am with someone I've known for a while, surprisingly a long amount of time. I actually met Jill before I got into employer brand specifically. So Jill Dudones is let's get the right title. Let's do this right. Director of Strategy at Gyro. She's been at a number of agencies. She's worked at, if you go to her LinkedIn, she's got all sorts of agencies and brands that she's done amazing work for. And what I just found out right before we started is that she worked at the same agency I did before the agency we worked at that I remembered. So she's been doing employer brand and talent recruitment and talent marketing for a very long time. So I am thrilled to be able to have this conversation. Everybody welcome Jill. Jill, everybody, Jill.
Everybody welcome James.
It's the level of formality and structure and seriousness that everybody comes to expect from these sorts of things. Okay, so let's just dive right in, because I think you and I talked a little bit about this, and I think we're on the same page in this idea that employer branding is, yes, it's relatively new, but how new is new? I mean, I talk about it, from a Simon Burroughs 1992, London beginning. How do you see the employer brand beginning? When did it become really real, especially in the States?
I think it became real right after the last downturn, when companies were, struggling to survive. There were a lot of layoffs, and when that happens, a lot of changes happen internally. And when they come out, it's like, oh my goodness, we need to hire. Um, there was a shift from the seriousness of brand building at about, I would say, 2011, 2012, thinking, okay, this short term work to kick out some collateral to get some sales and some tactics to get to increase our sales so we can survive, shifted to like longer term brand building. And within that, that's when the employer brand started to, well, how do we hire and how do we leverage this brand building that we're doing for our talent audiences? And I think that's at the point that, the word employer brand started to be used quite often. And then all of a sudden by 2018, we had quite a few large Fortune 100, 200 companies that had employer brand functions. Even some smaller companies or mid-sized companies were starting to have them as well. But that's kind of, overall where I think it started. However, um, uh, employer branding has been done through the title of recruitment marketing for a long time. And that's where I began my career around 1999 with Nike, no less, at TMP Worldwide. When, if anyone can remember the child labor law violations that Nike was exposed for, they had to think about, okay, how do we represent ourselves in admit our wrongdoing to our broader consumer audience, and then how do we transform who we are as an employer? And that's the project, though I was very green, and did a lot of research around that. That's where I began my work in employer branding. And now what they thought it, how they of course didn't call it an employer brand, but it was a campaign. And so it was a campaign that ran omni-channel back then, which was everything, and even a digital landing page at that time, they did as well. But it was about, okay, let's have a campaign that runs globally for all of our audiences to get to know us better as an employer and what we value and what we are going to commit to, in terms of offering our talent audiences and our consumer audiences. So that was my first exposure to it. And since then, um, between that time and then around 2011, 2012, employer brand was, they were campaigns. They were really marketing recruitment campaigns. There wasn't a lot of thought put into place. And okay, well, where does this sit in our larger brand architecture, as it relates to our corporate brand value proposition, our purpose, our mission, our vision? Where does it fit? And even today, a lot of companies are having that challenge. And some of the work that I do, I would say about 25% of my agency work is in employer branding, and that's a question that I help large companies, specifically B2B, figure out. Um, so that's historically, where it went from a campaign driven activity to now a brand building exercise within the talent space. That's how things have evolved.
So it's almost a function of how where's the end of the horizon for these people. First, it's how do I get the butt in the seat? You've got a horizon of about 60 to 90 days. You've got a horizon of campaign, which is 3 to 6 months, and then you've got a horizon now in modern employer brand, which is functionally ever, right? It's
Right.
infinite. It is, we want to keep building this brand and growing it and evolving it and nurturing it and feeding it so it becomes the brand we want it to be, that it has a much longer half-life than anything a campaign related.
Right, right. And, uh, it's right now, well, before the pandemic, when talking with clients, and they'd say, okay, well, great, we've just put together our employer brand value proposition. We've got that. We've got our messaging. We have our message maps based on our key talent roles. We've got everything. We've got our rollout plan. We're ready to go. This is going to live forever, right? And the answer is no. Before the pandemic, we would advise every 36 months taking a look at it and evolving it, whether that's shifting around the pillars within a message house to to be more relevant, or it's shifting the value proposition altogether as well. It needs to live and breathe, and so it needs to change and adapt. I mean, I can't imagine, and unfortunately, I will say that I worked on a very large employer brand project for over a year with a large credit and risk analysis company that everyone's heard of, and we worked on it for a long time. It came out, it's perfect, it's ready to launch, and then the pandemic hit. And some of the
Yeah.
messaging that we were using for that was it was very purpose-led and purpose-driven language and, position, and then, COVID happened, and wow, all brands are talking about purpose right now, and so there was there was a lot of clouded space for that, so,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's you have to be nimble and you have to evolve quickly, and 36 months is the longest, and I think that COVID is going to shorten that, and that may look something more like 18 months, if not 12.
So you're expecting most companies to really seriously consider, not just kind of touch base, but seriously consider evaluating and measuring and considering their employer brand EVP every 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, I think so.
Holy crap, that's amazing.
What do you think?
I have no idea, frankly. I part of it, and I think I want to get back to this because, there's a lot of trends and fashion in employer brand right now. Like if you look at every article, everything is about, God, no, what's the word I'm looking for? The purpose. It's all purpose driven. That every employer brand should be about purpose. What's the purpose? And I don't think that that's true. I think that's just pure fashion. So, yeah, I think in your case, if the fashion kind of ends up being where you want it to go and you've clouded the waters and you've made, you're one of many, then yeah, you got to pivot a bit. But at the same time, did the company really change? So I guess the question is
Yes.
in the mathematics, in the equation of what your employer brand is, some of it is external, some of it is internal. Those things change at different rates and at different speeds. So how often do you evaluate to say, did we change? Did they change? Did we change in the same way? We change in very different ways, and that's how you reevaluate.
And that is what has been happening over the past 10 months, is that companies are changing significantly to adapt to the unpredictability that's been thrown at them because of the pandemic. And so, for instance, we're seeing companies collapse, we're seeing mergers and acquisitions, and reorganizations. Some companies are filing for Chapter 11, but they're getting funding and have to reemerge. So the companies, and again, I work with large enterprise B2B, so this is not so much B2C, but with B2C companies are going through enormous amount of change right now. And so, with the reorganization, for instance, a top tier consultancy that I worked with was, redefining what regions they were going to make their primary regions, and they were adapting new operating models there. And so they had to redefine their culture and the relationship that people have with the brand. Um, there was a leading satcom that I worked with who filed for Chapter 11, and they got a ton of funding to reemerge. But you know what? They had to get rid of all of their leadership. So they needed to kind of rebrand themselves as, who are we in terms of, as an employer, not only as a brand, we did that work too, but as an employer, who are we? Because they had some pretty awful perceptions about the people
Yeah.
who drove the company into the ground.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
sure if you're Wells Fargo, if you had a huge scandal in front of you, you
right.
have to. And I'm not saying we're not calling out Wells Fargo. It's just that's an obvious one. So, what are some other like milestone or must can't miss kind of opportunities to say, hey, things have changed enough that we have to consider? You've got changing leadership. You've got global pandemic. I think that was a given, or at least unstated. What else?
I think the other part of it is, there are two areas, and one you mentioned purpose, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But the other area is, okay, we're getting beat up in the market right now because we're a big old company. We've been slow to adapt, so you know what? We need to be a tech company. Every single company I have spoken with over the past 3 years, the need behind whatever it is they needed was, you know what? We need to become a tech company, and they don't, because it's not a differentiator. It's not, they just need to put tech at the core of their business, which they
Yeah.
haven't had time or haven't cared to do. And so when they do that, It's, you know what? We have to attract tech talent, but nobody wants to work here because they all want to work at Google and Amazon. And
If you're a
um,
hospital, if you're a bank, if you're a warehouse, if you're, yeah, you are tech companies and you need that tech
right,
talent, but that talent's looking someplace else.
right. And so usually the need comes when the your employee ratios change within across roles. And so, okay, so now we have to recruit 13,000 techs globally as opposed to last year we only recruited 88. So, how do we do that? And how do we shift our employer brand? Because not only are we going to get all of these techs, we kind of are starting to transform, which means a cultural mindset shift, which means the other people who we hire have to be forward thinking. And so that is one of the big, shifts that I've seen over the past couple years, and even more right now. And that something that's happening. So it's a need for a different kind of skill set. Um, and we know that techs are deeply in demand. And of all of the different functions over the past 10 months, they've only lost 6%. 6% of them have lost their jobs in some way, whether it was their choice or their employer's choice. But that's the lowest out of the unemployment numbers in the US over the past 10 months. And so those people are really, really difficult to recruit because everybody wants them. But yeah, so a change in the roles that you need. And then the other part of it is purpose. Now you talked about it being in vogue and everybody, it's the fashionable thing to do is to look at purpose. Well, there's a reason why it's happening, and it's not so much fashion, but there's a business case for it. And again, I work in B2B mostly, and over the past, oh gosh, since around 1986, there were companies who were starting to believe in purpose and put it and have strong purpose statements, and not just a purpose statement as, why we exist, but an actionable purpose of, this is what we do um, um, to, live out or to, uh, exemplify what our purpose is. And, like Patagonia is one of them in 1986.
I got to stop you there because you can't. I think it's too easy to go to Patagonia for purpose. It's like saying tech company slash Apple or design company slash Apple.
Right.
We got what's another good example that I might be surprised by when you think about purpose. Not Patagonia, not REI, not a nonprofit. What's a great company doing purpose really really well?
Well, again, I look mostly at B2B companies, and
That's all right.
Salesforce is, I would say, doing an amazing job. And they talk the talk and then they walk the walk in terms of purpose. But when I mentioned Patagonia, they were the first company to tip their toes into what is called a dual purpose company. Before they were called dual purpose companies, or you might think of them as B Corps. They started becoming B Corps in 2007. But what's happened is, while Patagonia kind of started that around 1986, it's really gaining speed. And in the World Economic Forum last year, the Davos Manifesto, their purpose statement for that forum was, the universal purpose of a company is the fourth industrial revolution. That is what they stated. And we're seeing other companies follow. And as I said, there's a business case for being purpose, led or purpose driven. Um, that 83% of companies outperform on revenue than other companies because of their purpose statement. It informs everything in terms of value, their supply chain, um, and that's because 78% of Americans will tell other people to buy from a company that's purpose driven. And 71% of B2B buyers specifically are more likely to purchase when they see their personal value reflected in a company's purpose. And these are new stats that came out in April, but there has been a business case being made for purpose um, since 2010. And between 2010 and I should have written down his name. I forgot his name. He very famous marketing professor who wrote many books that we've all read. Sorry, his name is escaping me, but he reported a 206% stock market outperformance between 2010 and now for companies who are purpose led or purpose driven companies.
So
So
you're in the purpose is really a big part of your
I
employer brand
it's a
camp.
it's a big part of your brand when you do something to exemplify it, and that means that you don't just have a fun, happy purpose statement that everyone can feel
More than a
really good
poster.
about, but there are actually initiatives that your company is funding or expanding due to its commitment. So there is an action for it. And this and I know we're talking about on the commerce or the consumer side, but this really impacts talent because the same people who are driving purpose as consumers, and especially millennials, are driving purpose as employees. And they want to be able to see the impact of their work. And so I've done many surveys and qualitative interviews over the past 3 years, and about 3 years ago, it was came in at about number three. Is I want to be able to make an impact. I want to have a greater purpose in my job, and that's at about a number two right now. And the pandemic has really driven that up. So that is why we're seeing those messages, is because there's an actual business case for it, and there's a very strong talent need for it. So I don't think that what happens next. Who knows? I mean, really, but that's one of the things that's really important to talent. And how do we show talent that we're really committed and they're going to make a difference when they come work here? And that even from the tech talent who I spoke about, that's super important.
So, what are some other things that you think of beyond purpose when you're considering culture, EVP, employer brand? What are the things you look for? Maybe a bigger, better question is when you're looking at an employer brand, what's the first thing you look at to evaluate the employer brand?
Well, the first thing that we look at is eh, how well is it functioning, first of all, and what the results are of how it functions. And so a lot of times, and I know I'm speaking broadly, but a client will come to us and say, we need a new employer brand. We need a new EVP. And the question is always why, and they're like, well, we need to attract another audience or et cetera, like I mentioned before. But then you start to dig into it and you realize, you know what, you didn't really have an employer brand to begin with. And so that's the first area, is diagnosing the problem. And sometimes the problem is that, your EVP actually doesn't matter. It's the delivery of being on lots of different channels and reaching your talent where they are with the right message that you're just not doing, because all you're doing is going to career fairs and setting up a booth.
So I want to stop right there because I think that's a fascinating kind of situation because I always approach situations like that saying every company has an employer brand. It's just not necessarily intentional or not necessarily serving them in terms of attracting and hiring the talent they want. Are you saying you see companies or you think of companies as having and not having an employer brand or not having a formal employer brand?
I don't think that. I mean, of course they have, every company has its own sort of feel, and internally they have a type of feel that you could say that that is that is their employer brand. It's just not defined. I think of that more as culture, though, um,
Hmm. Okay.
because I feel that the employer brand is a delivery mechanism of culture, and a lot of times there's nothing that's integrating that on the internal, within the company, as well as external, on the outside of the company. And sometimes a lot of problems that we see with, hey, help us do a new EVP, is that they're only engaging the external audience and they've completely forgotten about their employees.
Hmm. Okay.
But
So,
yeah.
and I think that is absolutely fascinating. And literally stopped and wrote down that line. Employer brand is the delivery of culture. I think that is an excellent encapsulation of an idea. Now, in order for someone to get value out of that, I think because not only is employer brand poorly defined in general, so is culture. So if you're saying employer brand is the delivery of culture, how are you defining culture? What are the guidelines you're putting around it? What are the guide rails you're putting around it? How are you seeing it where it is more than a poster? It is more than just the motto and the things you say instead of, what it really is. How do you approach culture?
I believe that culture is at the hub of a wheel within a corporation, and everything that the corporation or the company, enterprise, whatever you want to call it, touches is a stream for which culture to flow through. So that is product. Culture should be through product. It should be through every single touch point that an audience member has, whether that's a candidate, uh, or it is a customer, or it is an employee. So that's everything from product to customer service to your digital experience to um, your ERG groups to onboarding to training, development, um, and product development, even the process of product development, your infrastructure, everything. So culture is this kind of, life source that runs through all of it. And of course it runs through employer brand as well, as it's part of a corporate brand or a corporate structure or I'm sorry, it's part of an organizational structure, or it's part of a brand structure. So it's kind of like the blood of a enterprise, really. And so everyone has a different type of blood type. And
By the
they're
way, I love being on a conversation where someone's going to try and out metaphor me, and that
no,
that
I'm
doesn't
not.
happen very often. So I love it.
I'm pretty literal and direct, so no, that doesn't happen often. So don't worry, I won't be doing
No,
that.
go for it.
But that's really what it is. It's this sort of life force that flows through everything, and that I really believe. I know we worked together at Flirt, and we had a few clients who we worked on cultural experiences with, and I really believe this conversation I would have with quite a few of them is that you can't force a culture and you can't create one. You can
There it
only
is.
organically let it live and cultivate it and nurture it.
Mhm.
And it's like you can have a blood infusion, but you're still going to wind up with the same type, blood type that you have.
Mhm. And you're still going to think the same thoughts and you're still going to feel the same way. You might feel a little healthier because you've got, I don't know,
Right.
better blood. Let's extend that metaphor far past its legal obligation. No, I think that's completely true. I think there are too many companies think, oh, culture is what the leader says it is. I think leaders can set up kind of structures or tent poles and say, look, this is let's go back to, you've got a river metaphor, you've got nature metaphors. It is the trellis, and I want things to grow around this kind of structure. That doesn't mean every vine's going to go on every piece. It doesn't mean that the vine is going to grow equally across the board. It means that this is anticipation and encouragement, and maybe you're even incentivizing these ideas. But it's not the same as saying this is the culture.
Right. Right, exactly. And there's a lot of overlap between what we do with employer brand and what we do with culture to shift either one of those things. And sometimes when a client comes to us with an employer brand problem, it's a culture problem. And you and I are in this space, and our lines are continually being blurred between who are we as cultural change management experts versus who are we as marketing and brand experts versus who are we as talent experts, and those lines are being blurred. So a lot of times it's about helping to redefine the culture. We have a culture, but it's been defined incorrectly. We have not put our finger on what it really is about us that's unique or different, and that's some of the work that can happen in tandem with or before an employer brand project to kind of get that straight.
So, and I want to kind of put a little pin in that and kind of red flag that and say, look, it is about defining the culture, but that's defining the culture isn't the same as creating a culture. If you are looking at something and you say our culture is about A, B, and C, and you reinforce that and you keep talking about it, it's going to feel more A, B, and C. People are going to notice A, B, and C. but A, B, and C may not be the totality of the culture. You might be, in some cases, ignoring some fairly negative aspects of the culture, or the downside, or the edges of the
Right.
culture, where you're trying to say, look, yes, every human being is flawed and imperfect and yada, yada, yada. But what I like about Bob or Sue or whoever is I like their sense of humor, and that's the things I bring out in them. That's the things I like getting out of them. Are they sad sometimes? Sure. Are they sad when I'm not around? Maybe. But what I like about them is their sense of humor, and that's kind of how you approach culture. It's not the whole thing. It's about what are the things you cherry pick to pull out to say these are the things, imperfect as we are, as big as we are, these are the things that we like about ourselves and we wish we can always want to encourage more of. And that's the starting point. That becomes the hook by which you have a conversation.
Right. Exactly. And you talked a little bit about the negative aspects and defining and pointing those out. And that's really important. A project I'm doing now, they've done this huge cultural change management work in which they've defined their culture, and it's extremely complex. But one of the things that we're trying to show them where culture and employer brand kind of merge together and how we can dial up some aspects of what they've defined. And they're trying to understand, okay, well, why is that important? And especially the negative things. Why is that important? And one of the stats that I showed them, which is from October, it's a CHC study of 84% of women and 75% of men have left a company due to bad company culture since March. So these are people who, during a pandemic, during one of the worst unemployment rates in our history, have elected to leave a company because of bad culture. So it is
And
really,
let's get super fine on that. Not only have they elected to leave, they've elected to jump into a brand new company they only know
right?
limited pieces of information about. They have changed their complete and total life, just in blind faith almost.
Yes. And you and I have both joined a new company during this pandemic, and it's weird. It's not I don't care how well your company does it. It's not a natural experience, and it's an
What are you talking about? Just
uncomfortable.
because I haven't met my bosses yet.
You haven't seen The Office, you haven't gotten to really meet your coworkers. I've joined a new company 3 months ago, and I kind of feel like a freelancer because I'm working at home, people are just sending me things to do, and
Mhm.
it's weird, and they're doing their best, they really are, but I don't think there's any real way to fix that right now.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they've left the comfort of being at a company and their job security and their feeling of safety, just because the culture didn't match their values didn't match what the company's culture values were. So yeah, that's really important when we're looking at employer brand, is to consider that cultural advantage or disadvantage when we're trying to put together a value proposition and ultimately the messaging and rollout.
All right, so I want to take a little bit of a left-hand turn because you're one
Oh
of the
no.
people who I know. No, 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 you're going to love this. Uh, You're one of the few people I know I can talk to on a deeper level about the concept of brand structure or brand architecture.
Yep.
Most people in employer branding, it's not a good or bad. It's not on pointing fingers and saying they all suck or we all suck or whatever. It's just that we're not formally trained in branding. Most of us, most people, I know employer branders come from marketing side or recruiting side, but either way, it's a very rare day that they've taken a course in brand architecture or brand structure. And so consequently, we're very often fumbling in the dark for understanding why things happen or ways of describing what's occurring, especially as you're implementing, making it change, or putting stimulus to a brand and saying it's reacting to it. Why is that? And knowing and having a sense of our framework of what the brand is and what the structure is incredibly helpful for that. And to me, that is like the place where I think that's what's made me better at my job, is having a kit of structures and archetypes to go to say this is why this is happening.
Mhm.
And I know that you have a similar kit. You have a similar kind of body of work that you go to and say, I understand what brand structure is and what brand architecture is. And especially as you've touched on already, employer brand and the broader brand architecture are not separate. They're very much,
Right.
if not the same, then at least intertwined. So let's talk a bit about that. How do you see employer brand living inside the broader brand architecture?
So it depends on the organization and how they're structured and what their goals are, from a consumer standpoint as well as a talent standpoint. So, I've worked with agencies, and oftentimes agencies will like to standardize what that architecture is so that it simplifies our work so that we can deliver faster. I struggle with that because I not always. There are always some main touch points that stay intact, but for each project, I kind of alter, what that framework might look like for that brand in terms of where does the employer brand live and breathe. And that's also based on the fact of knowing who at the company is in place to help it live and breathe and be healthy, because sometimes there isn't really a robust team to do that work, and if the company isn't willing to hire an external party to do that, you have to really right size, how this employer brand is going to fit into the greater scheme of things. But
Just to be clear, are we talking about organizational structure or are we talking about brand structure?
Um, well, both really.
Okay.
And sometimes one influences the other, but if structure from an organizational structure perspective, if there isn't enough, or there aren't the right people to be able to support the employer brand needs to be shifted within its brand structure. And that's usually how I look at it first, is based on, okay, what is doable here? Um, but ultimately, yeah, you're right. There are some frameworks that I will rely on. And it's usually, there's a lot of terminology that we throw around as marketers and strategists. It's
That's how we scare
ridiculous.
people.
It is. And there's, it's funny because I'm pulling up a PowerPoint that I have that has taken all of the different brand frameworks that I have worked on and all of the different definitions for all of those components that I have used, and they are so diverse. Um,
That
but
sounds great.
overall, I really believe that the first thing that sits on, if we think about hierarchy, and the first thing that is at the top is business strategy. And that's one thing that employer branders and, employer brand teams who are, cross functional, who are working together to try to build employer brand, don't always consider the business strategy. And you really need to put whatever the business strategy is on top, because that informs talent needs. And so if you have business strategy on top, talent needs, then below that, I'm sorry, business strategy on top, which incorporates internal brand, which would be mission, vision, and purpose. And everyone has some people don't have, some companies don't have all three of those. Sometimes they just have one, sometimes they have two, sometimes they have more than those three things. But then there's
Depends on what consultant they hired and how much they paid them. Go ahead.
yes. Exactly. And I'm in the mindset that, simple is better. But you have the business strategy on top. You have the internal brand that lives underneath that mission, vision, purpose that supports that, and then you have, working outwardly, the corporate brand value proposition. And under that is talent and culture, and that envelops a sub pillar of the brand for DEI and its value proposition, employer brand and its value proposition, and the ESG CSR proposition. And that is how a very simple top down framework that generally seems to work in some capacity, for where the employer brand sits. Now, oftentimes, what will happen is clients will want to shove the DEI and the ESG value propositions inside of the employer brand, and I am not in agree with that ever.
Okay, so before we get into that, CSR is a corporate social responsibility.
Yes.
DEI is diversity, equity, inclusion.
Mhm.
ESG is the new one on me.
in environmental sustainability governance.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay. So yeah, so you're saying they want to put all of that stuff and dump it inside an employer
Yeah,
brand structure.
they become two pillars, sometimes one pillar, and you'll have, on top of the messaging for an EVP, you'll have a core message, and then you'll have supporting pillars. And always they want to shove in a pillar that says diversity and inclusion.
Mhm, mhm.
And it is so annoying to have to deal with that because it's an afterthought. It's like, "Oh, yeah, we've gotta get the diversity in there. Oh, yeah, it's
Yeah.
important to us." And
It almost suggests that all the rest of your brand structure is for white men, and here's the one pillar for non-white men.
exactly, exactly. And by the way, we have to have the business case to actually hire those diversity, hires. So, let's put that as a proof point within the pillar. Um and that is a conversation I've heard many times as well. We're committed to diversity inclusion now, and as of 8 months ago, it's DEI. We're committed to that right now because we've done the research and it supports the business. And it
Wow.
every time it's just like it's not about do the right thing here. It's just there's a business case.
Mhm.
There's a business case to hire women. There's a business case to hire people of color, you know?
Yeah,
If
that to me has always been the struggle is that when you frame DEI in a moral case, it okay, that's great, do that, but not at business. The business and morals don't really go hand in hand.
Yeah,
There's some sort of overlap, but you can't make a purely moral discussion in a business case. However, you're right. There are absolutely business reasons why diversity is
yeah,
incredibly
exactly.
important.
Of
And if you
course.
don't frame it that way, it's like saying I have an apple and I have a Studebaker and I'm going to glue them together. And you're like, whoa, 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 that's not going to fit.
Right, right, right. But, I strongly believe that the DEI should have its own value proposition and be its own component of the corporate brand, as should anything that's CSR related. I don't think that, you only develop the messaging for them when you're doing an employer brand work and thinking, "Oh, we've gotta come up with something for that." And that's
Okay.
oftentimes
But
what happens.
But if that's the case, if I'm counting right, you've got what the brand is for employer brand, what the brand is for corporate brand, what the brand is for consumer brand, what the brand is potentially for marketplace brand, what the brand is for investor relations, what the brand is for environmental, social good, and governance rather. And then now you've got D&I. I've got 7 different audiences who are touching this thing called brand, each thinking they have their own part of it, and yet somehow it's all the same. How do you put your head around that, or how do you grapple with that?
Well, they each have their own, so each one of those components of the brand, ideally, and it gets even more complex than that when you think about different business divisions, and each business division will layer up to the corporate brand, strategy. They each have their own sets of positioning that layer up in some way to the corporate brand. So, it's like building a house and these are all of the rooms within it, but you know what? They're all made out of, a certain type of wood. So
Yeah,
it's part
one
of
room
the
is in a
structure.
castle, one room is in like I don't know, a bungalow. They have to be the same kind of house.
Right. Of course, they can look a little bit different, but structurally, they're made out of the same material because they have to, because that material is holding the whole house together. And I'm usually not this, metaphorical when I talk, but
It's me. I blame me. I'm the influencer.
because I'm usually pretty direct and boring and dry. Well, I am now right now too, but I mean, usually I'm just like, yes, that is correct. No, it is. But,
This is not a deposition. Come on, take it to the next level.
but, so it's not that complex once you start to blueprint everything out, and so, DEI would sit within have its own value proposition that, of course, layers up to the corporate brand. It would have its own support pillars. It would be pulled into that messaging would be pulled into other parts of the brand depending on, the audience, uh, the key audience or the audience segments that were being pulled into or communicated with. So it really it depends on what the initiative is, and again, it depends on what the business strategy is, that informs those initiatives. But yeah, they basically live together. They live in the same house in different rooms, and um, sometimes different initiatives flow in and out of. all of them, so to speak.
Yeah, so I'll be your metaphorical speaker on that one. I'll say, look, the bathroom and the bedroom are both rooms in the same house, but one has carpeting, one doesn't, because they serve different functions, and
Right,
those
exactly.
functions and those
Thank you.
tactics don't overlay.
What
Yeah,
I'm curious along these lines, and you have so much experience dealing with this, and you've been in a lot of different places and some pretty impressive clients in the past and impressive employers. And I'm curious about where you see employer brand doing I guess, living in its best life within the corporate brand. Like, how do you envision that, or how do you explain that?
Yeah, I think of it in terms of a maturity model. I guess is probably the closest thing you
Yeah.
can think of, and that is, on one side you have employer brand is a function of putting the butts in the seats, and it is pure recruitment, pure transactional, and then you kind of pilot some ideas about employer brand just to see, does this work for my company? Does this make any kind of sense? And then you say, okay, it does make sense. Let's kind of invest in it. Let's standardize it or formalize it inside the team. Let's go ahead and grow it and make it more advanced. And then finally, the more platonic ideal is this idea that there is simply a brand and everybody touches the same brand and treats it as the process of supporting the brand is a shared process. It's a shared service. Is that
Mhm.
I only touch part of it, but I know that my part impacts your part. And I look at like a delta, and I know I've talked about Holland and what she does and her role over there, and that they don't have a standalone employer brand function in so much as they simply have a brand function, and she is the
Mm.
overseer, the facilitator, the supporter, the cheerleader or champion of how a candidate employee sees and touches and it feels that brand. That to me is where, you know, the where it needs to be, but it's such a journey to get there because brand has been so built around this idea of how do I sell tacos? How do I
Right,
sell ice cream
right,
cones? How do I, I'm going to use this thing to stick, I mean, let's be fair. We're still telling people brand and logo are different things. And we're still very much in 1970s thinking in a lot of companies,
right.
getting them to this idea that a brand is a shared concept and construct of which everybody gets to perceive and understand it and use it in different ways is like quantum physics for some of these people. So it is a huge leap, and that's why it's hard to get to. The ones who can do it, I'm stunned by their ability to survive incredibly hard situations, incredibly hard contexts of the pandemic and business cases or what have you.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's funny, it's quantum physics. I don't know if you've seen the articles that came out about 3 or 4 months ago, maybe it's a little bit longer, on quantum marketing, and it just
I'm going to have to. That's a term I'm not familiar with, so I'm going to have to go look those up. That's
no, it's
terrifying and
a
exciting all at once.
buzzword. You know how we all try to redefine what we're doing to make it sound even more
Mhm.
impressive than what we're really doing, and
So
that's
we charge high
basically
rates.
what
Yeah.
it is. Um, but it's just really the optimization of AI and machine learning and how you
Ah,
apply that to account-based marketing. But
yeah.
it's funny how we sometimes I feel that, we're talking about the structures of brand, and marketers and strategists and brand experts really need to stop making our work sound more complicated than it actually is, because simplification um, is just the way of getting clearer and more targeted toward our goals and
Yeah.
getting results. It amazes me sometimes,
But
how we have to complicate, but
but simplification to the world suggests dumbness, and simplification to us suggests room for people to project and to personify and personalize that idea. That there's
yeah.
just this simple idea that what it means to you and what it means to me may be subtly different, but because I can make those subtle changes, it feels more connected to me and therefore more powerful, more useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, simplification, I think, is that's the way to go. Before we wrap up, it is we're recording December 22nd, 2020 still. Good God. Yeah, this may not come out till January, but 2021, either a prediction or what's one thing you think everybody should look at or look for when kind of grappling with their employer brand.
I think they should be making sure that they are able to adapt to change. That's number one. Um,
And if they've gotten this far without doing so, that's a given.
but I think next year is going to be the big aha that, oh, we have to be a little bit more, and I hate to use the word agile, but, nimble and flexible in terms of, uh, of our messaging as well as our delivery. And then the second thing is to keep, it's kind of along those lines, but keep open communication with talent, not only your employees, but um, external candidates or potential candidates. It's something that companies don't normally do, but I think the best way to keep a pulse on what's shifting and changing is to create a dialogue with them. And that can be in a number of different ways, whether it's seminars or webinars, digital experiences, and then perhaps live in-person experiences toward the end of next year. But things are going to are not stable, and they won't be stable for a while. And the best way to do that is just to keep open communications. And I think trends that we're going to be seeing is that as we've seen purpose be more prominent within corporate brand, and ultimately we're seeing that it's a trend and fashionable within employer brand. um, I think what we're going to wind up seeing is, how does that evolve and shift to not just a belief statement, but how we're measuring our purpose and action. And so I think that's going to be very important to employees next year, or talent next year, is seeing that metric of tell me how much impact am I really going to make? And don't just give me a bunch of fluffy bullet points, but really show me tangibly, can I affect this community by 30% by doing XYZ as customer service or sales, et cetera. And I think that will be something that we'll be seeing.
Yeah, you've described kind of an anti-fragile methodology, an anti-fragile approach to saying, look, rather than say, let's prepare for when things start to change or when things get crazy, just assume it's always going to be
Yeah.
crazy. So what do you build around that idea? And I think I can't agree with you more. It is a complete shift in worldview for everybody. And I think only some people have embraced it. I think there's still way too many talent acquisition pros just looking at their watch going, well, by June, we'll be back to normal. And
Right.
you're like,
It's not.
no. Yeah, that ain't happening. Jill, thank you so much for being on the show. What the heck? The podcast. Wow, I just tripled my salary right there by
Maybe
calling
it
the show.
should be a show.
Maybe that's what it is.
Maybe we should, you should get a set, and that could be fun.
There's a virtual Zoom background that will be just the set. That's what it'll be. Jill Dudones over at Gyro. She's out of you're still in Chicago, right? You haven't moved.
I'm not going anywhere. Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you so much for being on here. If you want to get in touch with Jill, aside from LinkedIn, I will put a link in the show notes. Is there any other way people can get in touch with you?
Oh, no, just, check me out on LinkedIn or Twitter. I have non-boring tweets on Twitter, so go there.
Perfect.
My LinkedIn is boring, business stuff. I try to shake it up, but nobody likes it. So go to Twitter and direct DM me or email me, either way.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jill.
Thanks
everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Do you love news about LinkedIn, Indeed, Google, and just about every other recruitment tech company out there?
Hell yeah. I'm Chad.
I'm Cheese.
We're the Chad and Cheese Podcast.
All the latest recruiting news and insights are on our show.
Dripping in snark and attitude.
Subscribe today wherever you listen to your podcasts.
We out.